That idea then about an idea, which I guess is fundamentally what you're learning from John Cage, that it's about an idea, not necessarily a sound or a style or a genre. I suppose ultimately takes us to those pieces that I think you've called your equivalent of the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction, which is Sinking of the Titanic and Jesus' Blood. They're conceptual pieces. I mean, it's interesting when you talk about Sinking of the Titanic, you're essentially saying that you were trying to achieve the musical equivalent of a piece of conceptual art.
That's right.
So that's coming out of that entire period between, say, Joseph Holbrook and the end of the 60s, the idea that you were thinking about what is the idea that I actually want to achieve more than what is it going to sound like.
Well, the Titanic piece, that came up, I was working in an art college, and there was a group of students who were not doing either painting or sculpture or printmaking. They were doing other things. They were doing events, doing installations, some different sorts of things. And they were sort of under attack by some of the more conservative element within the college. And so they put on an exhibition of their work, and they asked those members of staff who were sympathetic if they might put something in themselves. So I put in this single-page typescript a sketch for the sinking of the Titanic. And the idea of actually putting writings on the wall was something which was around at that time in the fine arts, in conceptual art, with groups like Art Language and Joseph Kossuth, who had these rigorous texts which you would read. They were not beautiful artworks. And in this I described what a piece called The Sinking of the Titanic might be. And my idea was that this was about ideas that by reading this, it could trigger your imagination to working out what the piece might be like. Rather like if you're listening to a radio play, you can envisage the space in which things are happening. Your mind does more work. What I did eventually, in the mid-70s, I published I wrote a lot of research notes, the ideas that form the Titanic piece. And now while it's published by Schott, I've put together these research notes alongside the piece so that you can have all the data that will produce the performance. But if you want to go further beyond that, you can look into these and find other things you might inject in there. And the piece has moved on. As I did it from time to time, I would add other things. From the first performance, I added other things. And I did the piece more or less up to the time it was recorded in the mid-70s, and then I stopped doing it. And then I was asked to do it again in 1990, because by then, the Titanic had been found. So when I wrote it had been a mysterious, legendary object somewhere in the North Atlantic, about 5.5 miles deep, several hundred miles from the coast of Nova Scotia, was now a reality.
What triggered your initial fascination? Because what's interesting also with the development of the piece over the last 30 odd years is an increasing fascination, increasing knowledge of people, obviously with the big movies as well, of the idea of the Titanic. But when you first came to it, it wasn't necessarily such a strong idea.
Well, maybe not such a strong idea, but it was still, if anyone talked about a major marine disaster, the Titanic was the one. Even though the Lusitania was just as big a disaster not long afterwards, it was the Titanic. And it was the whole area around it. The fact it was on its maiden voyage, it contained within its passengers some of the wealthiest and most privileged people in the world. It was its maiden voyage. It had even been said to be unsinkable. They advertised that it was unsinkable. So all that meant it had far more attention than anything else. And then also all the kind of legends around it, and some of those legends, many of which are actually fact, which led me to the piece. The first one really being the behaviour of the ship's musicians. That's what first led me to it, and especially the report of their behaviour by the junior wireless operator. He said that as the ship went down, it sank at 2:20 in the morning. For the last 5 minutes, it was more or less on its end like that. In that last 5 minutes, the band who had been playing on the deck, playing light music, played a hymn. They played this hymn, which he said was a hymn called Autumn. And he said, however they did it, he couldn't imagine. And they continued to play as the ship went down. And there was no record of them having stopped. So my imagination was they were still playing as they went under the water. The idea of the music is somehow transformed by moving into this different acoustic space of water, which is 4 times more efficient as a sound projection medium than air. Sound travels a long ways to witness the kind of the songs of whales, dolphins, all the rest of it. But the sonic element within the sea is incredible. So all those things led one thing to led to another. But it was that little thing first, the band. And the first thing I had to do was to find out who were the musicians. And there were 8 of them. What did they play? There were 2 pianos, 3 violins, 2 cellos, and a bass player. I even had pictures of them. I even knew their names. And I worked out where on the ship they'd played, which rooms had pianos, and so on. And when the ship was sinking, was it possible for the pianists to have played at the end? I worked out how they could have got pianos onto the top deck. And there was a moment where electricity failed, so the service lifts couldn't do it. I thought it was very unlikely that they would have carried a piano at that moment onto the deck. Very unlikely. So I left pianos out of the initial instrumentation. So all those things, it's to do with research. I read the Board of Trade reports. I met survivors, interviewed survivors. I used some of their testimony within the piece, fragments and so on, all kinds of things. And one thing leads to another. And just all the time I was finding new things and putting them in.